Over 64 billion Pokemon cards have been printed, and today we're gonna look at the worst ones, from Pokemon that just can't seem to catch a break, Pokemon that have barely dented the competitive metagame in the complete 25-year Pokemon trading card game history. We're gonna look at a few from each generation and rank them too. The higher up the tier list, the worse the Pokemon has been. Let's begin. Kabutops. So when I was researching for every Pokemon's best ever card, I cottoned on that Kabutops is one of the most tragic Pokemon in the TCG. A lot of this is due to the nature of Stage 2s in Pokemon being notoriously harder to get into play than Basics or Stage 1s, since you'd have to use rare candy to get them into play at a reasonable pace. This on its own is not a death sentence. We have seen many Stage 2s see a lot of play, like Gardevoir and Vikavolt for example, but what really compounds this issue for old Kabutops here is that it is a fossil too. Fossil Pokemon are largely a meme in the Pokemon trading card game, always having complicated and strange mechanics to get into play that really warrant a video on its own. So Kabutops being a Stage 2 fossil makes it borderline impossible to get him into play, it feels like. So they have to be game changing when they hit the field to be worth it. And well, that has just never been the case. This one managed to win the Japanese National Championships 2004. And to be fair, if it was in the active, it would stop both players from evolving any Pokemon. We have seen this kind of effect actually get banned in the expanded format thanks to Archeops, so in theory, this is pretty good. And funnily enough, it had some interesting synergy with Cradily EX as well, who would stop your opponent from evolving their active while it was in the active as well. This also saw a little bit of play when paired with Kabutops EX2. Its Hydro Cutter attack would let you flip a coin for each energy attached to Kabutops, up to a maximum of 3 times, and you would deal 40 damage for each heads. So if you was feeling particularly lucky, 3 for 120 would be, well, pretty good actually at the time, but most likely you would be in the 40 to 80 damage range, which was very, well, meh. Especially when you consider the extreme lengths you would go into to get Kabutops into play via those fossils. And bear in mind, this was 2004, so we had big hitters like Blaziken EX and Magma Groudon knocking about. Not to mention Kabutops EX had 2 weaknesses as well. To be fair, I could find evidence that Kabutops EX did win a state championships in Illinois in 2004. But what I find really strange about this is that the Hydro Cutter attack is exactly the same as the Neo Discovery Kabutops, except this one wasn't an EX, which makes the EX, well, seem rather underpowered in comparison. I also saw this Kabutops get 3rd and 4th place at Malaysia Nationals when it was paired with Omastar and Aerodactyl, but finding the exact list was, well, impossible. But for every Kabutops that saw some level of play, there were like 5 that were so awful they never, ever left binders. Like this one from Fates Collide, which would deal a maximum 140 damage on a coin flip, or heal 50, which is dreadful, let alone it coming from a Stage 2 fossil. Crystal Kabutops has a horrible attack cost, while needing 3 coin flips to deal any relevant damage. Fossil Kabutops, in my opinion, is one of the worst cards ever printed. For 4 straight fighting energy, you would deal a whopping 40 damage, and heal half the damage that you did do. Which really didn't matter because you only had 60 total HP and was weak to Jungle Cypher as well, in a format where Hitmonchan or Farfetch'd with plus powers were knocking about too. All of this made Kabutops a very sad Pokemon who hasn't done any metagame damage since 2008 and will probably stay that way for a while. And with that all being said, I have to put Kabutops as an S tier bad Pokemon. Sorry about that. Golem. So much like Kabutops, Golem suffers with high energy attacks that just don't deal enough damage, all while being a Stage 2 as well. So let's have a look. The first bit of success I could find for Golem was Golem EX from Dragon, which got 1st place at a Gym Challenge Illinois 2004 in juniors, paired with Sceptile. Although the list isn't archived anywhere, I can guess how it worked. Sceptile had the Trans Power, which would let you move around grass energy attached to your Pokemon. This was normally paired with Sceptile EX to hit for big damage, or Muck EX to lock off other powers. This actually won the Norway Nationals in 2004. This list was probably using Golem EX because of Double Edge dealing 120 damage, which was okay, but dealing 50 damage back to yourself really wasn't ideal. Magnitude was interesting, but dealing 10 damage to all your bench Pokemon as well as your opponents still really isn't no fun. This deck also played Arbok as an alternative attacker via Toxic, which would deal extra poison damage and reduce 10 damage done to itself via its body. There was also a Golem deck that got 3rd place at Ontario Gym Challenge 2006, paired with Porygon 2, but there was no way of knowing what Golem it was between these two because the list hasn't been archived. It could have even been both, to be fair. This one could deal less damage to reduce damage done to itself by your opponent's attacks next turn, kind of interesting, and it could spread 30 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon, which, well, is only okay if I'm being perfectly honest. And this one could actually heal itself and use linear attack to spread damage. Rock Tumble was, average as well. But that's actually it for Golem cards seeing any competitive play. Alolan Golem GX did something interesting via Heavy Rocks GX, which should stop your opponent from playing any cards from their hand next turn, very interesting. But it was a stage 2 that needed 4 energy to attack, and that's why it saw 0 play. This one would deal 100 damage back to your opponent if it got KO'd from damage from your opponent, but again, stage 2, dealing 160 damage for 3 energy just isn't good enough. Now, to be fair, it is worth noting that Golem in TCG Pocket just won a big event, so if that counts as a Pokemon TCG in your opinion, then maybe we can move Golem up the rankings a little bit later. But for now, we have to admit that Golem has had a very sad time in the Pokemon TCG. Sad enough that it is our second S tier bad Pokemon, Sunflora. Now this makes me so sad because I love Sunflora, actually one of my favourite Pokemon, but I have to be honest, Sunflora has been done dirty in the Pokemon TCG. Now there have been some Sunflora that have had some fun effects, but none of them have seen much play. The only one that has seen some competitive success that I can find is this Sunflora from Heart Gold Soul Silver. It has the Sunshine Grace power, which lets you search your deck for a grass type Pokemon once per turn. This actually got 2nd place in the National Championship deck in the Netherlands, where it would search out Excelgor, Shelmet and the Vileplume pieces, not bad. It was also played in the Bear Hug deck that won US Nationals 2011 in the Juniors division, where it would search out for the Vileplume pieces, Roserade evolution lines as well, while attacking with Yanmega, of which Sunflower could search for as well. Apart from that though, Sunflora has seen 0 competitive play. This one's kind of interesting, which would let you ignore all energy costs from your fire and grass type next turn, which is very fun, leading to Charizard VMAX attacking for free, or Weedle single strike scroll as well. Bit of a banter, but again, a gimmick, nothing else. There are a couple Charizard EX counter Sunflora, like this Bright Beam one that would hit big damage, or this redacted Sunlight one, which would both, funnily enough, hit big damage into Charizard, but again, just not good enough. Meaning Sunflower, while brightening up my day plenty, will always have to sit in my binder doing nothing, apart from looking nice. Nice enough to make it an A tier bad Pokemon. Sorry about that, Sunflora. Mantine. Mantine is similar to Sunflora in the fact that it's a Gen 2 Pokemon that hasn't done too much metagame damage. It always seems to have interesting gimmicks, like this one that would heal 10 for each card you discarded from your hand. Except Mantine only had 100 HP, so healing probably isn't too relevant because it wouldn't be absorbing damage, it would just be KO'd. Now it's not all doom and gloom for Mantine though, as there have been 2 Mantine cards that have seen some level of metagame success. The first was this Mantine from Neo, which should see play in Scissor decks, since Scissor was normally a very tanky threat via metal energy buffs and gold berries. However, what Scissor couldn't deal with is fire types, mainly Macargo, who would detonate it thanks to weakness. In steps Mantine, who would actually one-shot Macargo for 2 energy via Giant Wave. This was a very good use case in that deck. But if we want to find a next usable Mantine, we have to fast forward 22 years. And to be fair, it was actually a build around this time. Born Ashore would force a basic Pokemon from any player's discard pile back onto their bench. So what Starlight's control players would do is if their opponent wasn't putting any good Pokemon for you to lock in the active for Snorlax, you would force them into play via Mantine. This made life very hard for players, because in order to successfully defend yourself against this, you would have to fill your bench with Pokemon that could attack before your opponent could force a bad one into play. Problem is, via the combination of Flute, Erica and Mantine, there really wasn't any safe place for you to have any non-attacking Pokemon, since if you held them in your hand, Erica could get them. If you left them in your deck, Fluke could get them, and if you discarded them, Mantine could get them. This combination saw Snorlax be a top 3 deck in format where it actually won 2 regionals, one of which I was commentating the final of. So with this level of success, I have to put Mantine as a D tier bad Pokemon. Generation 3, and first up we're looking at Swellow. Poor Swellow. In the video games, it's got a fun little Flame Orb Gut set that actually hits pretty hard. In the TCG though, Swellow hasn't had any good cards. Like, I scored all the archives I could find to find any trace of Swellow, and I just couldn't find any. This Delta Swellow would make your stage 2s have a 0 retreat cost, which is pretty fun, but in all honesty, if you're playing stage 2, you probably haven't got much space for another stage 1 that you'd never attack with. This Flash Fire one had half an escape rope on a once per turn ability, which again is kind of nice, but again, you're not going to really dedicate space to that, are you? The most interesting one was this ancient trait Swellow from Roaring Skies. Its Delta plus ancient trait would let it take an extra prize card if it KO'd something. Now, taking extra prize cards is normally very good in the Pokemon TCG, but see, the creatures were very clever. The Pokemon that they gave Ancient Trait plus 2 all had rubbish attacks. For example, this Wing attack would deal 50 damage. Doesn't look too terrifying, even with a Muscle Band. But to be fair, if you could somehow apply weakness, you could KO a Shaman with it for 3 prize cards. But how was you going to make a colourless Swellow hit for Lightning type? Well, that's where the evolutions from Ancient Origins would come in, as they would give your stage 1 Pokemon extra typing. So Flareon would give your stage 1 fire typing, and Jolteon would give your stage 1's electric typing. So with Jolteon and a Muscle Band, you could now KO Shaman with Swellow. It sounds fun, but as you can imagine, this was way too much effort and it saw 0 play, but interesting at the very least. Interesting enough to make Swellow a C tier bad Pokemon. Masquerain. There have been 13 Masquerain cards, and only one of them has seen any semblance of competitive play. And even then, it was a crutch card that really wasn't needed. Plasma Blast Masquerain would let you pick up tool cards from your Pokemon and put them back into your hand. This sometimes saw play in the Tool Drop archetype, where this Trubbish would do more damage for each tool card you had in play, and this Sigilith would let you attach 4 tool cards to it. This archetype was kind of viable, always a bit of a meme, and even then Masquerain wasn't really strictly necessary. Every other Masquerain card has had exactly 0 use cases throughout Pokemon history, and that makes me a little bit sad because it is a cool Pokemon. But since Masquerain did have exactly 1 use case in the deck, I'm going to put it in A tier. Swallow. Now, much like Masquerain, Swallow hasn't had much of a use case in its 20-year Pokemon history, except for this one in 2004, which actually ends up winning US Nationals paired with Wailord EX. Now, to be honest, the list hasn't been archived, and I can't really see any synergy between Swallow and Wailord, but hey, it won at Nationals, which is a lot more than I can say for some of the other Pokemon on this list. The most recent Swallow card is interesting, letting you do 170 damage for 1 energy, as long as the defending Pokemon has 0 energy attached to it. Which, to be fair, is great for picking off bench sitters like Lumineon V or Squawkabilly EX, for example. But to be fair, there are a number of Pokemon who can also pick up those bench sitters and can do it rather more efficiently, so that puts Swallow in C tier. Whiscash. Poor Whiscash, relatively cool Pokemon that has had 0 use cases ever in Pokemon history. Whiscash E4 would do 60 damage for 2 energy with energy gain, which is, to be fair, kind of efficient, but again, not good enough to see any play. This one from Primal Clash had the Alpha Growth Ancient trait, so you could attach 2 energy cards to it in a turn, meaning Earthquake could be lined up pretty easily, but when you consider it would deal 120 damage, which is slightly under par, and then do 20 to all your bench Pokemon as well, made it a lot less appealing. This Whiscash had the potential to mill 12 cards from your opponent's deck with its Raging and Rocking attack. It would discard the top card of your opponent's deck for each fighting energy card attached to it. So you would use 2 Archeops to attach 4 reversal energy to it in a single turn, which would all count for 3 energy cards as long as you were behind on prizes, meaning you had a 12 card mill at your disposal. Pretty fun. But that's it. That's the highlight of Whiscash cards all throughout Pokemon history. And standouts, well, that's putting it pretty lightly. So B tier it is for Whiscash. So now we're into Generation 4 and we're looking at Mothim. So Mothim has had 6 cards and none of them were any good. This one would let you move around damage to your Wormadam to any of your other Pokemon, which would have been good in theory if the Wormadams were actually good in format, but they obviously wasn't. This one would deal a table-shattering 120 damage for 2 energy if it evolved from Burmy this turn, which might be one of the worst rare cards we have ever seen in our standard format. This is currently legal now. Imagine using this against a Regidrago V-Star or something. This one would remove resistance and deal up to 120 extra damage for each different Wormadam you had in play, and this is probably the best one all things considered. Too bad it never saw any play though. Mothim has to be an A tier bad Pokemon with this track record. Floatzel is a pretty cool Pokemon, but he hasn't had the best of times in the Pokemon TCG. This Floatified one was meant to be a linchpin of controlling archetypes, since it would get back 2 item cards from your discard pile back into your hand. Now we have seen this kind of attack win the World Championships via Sableye, but on a stage 1 after Power Creep it's not as good, meaning it never really amounted to much. Now this one from Unleashed actually got a top 4 at a state championships in 2011. Its power would let you attach a water energy from your hand to itself once per turn. This did well with Magnezone Prime, who would draw cards, and it would do 50 for each energy you chose to send to the Lost Zone that was attached to your Pokemon. So this obviously meant for some good synergy. Floatzel GR Level X gave all your water Pokemon a built-in rescue scarf, so whenever they got KO'd, it would put them back into your hand instead of the discard pile. Not a bad little power to have, but it never saw any play. And that is a similar tale for the other Floatzel cards. All, well, never really seeing any competitive play, apart from that Unleashed one. So with that being said, it is a C tier bad Pokemon. Probopass. Probopass is one of the funniest Pokemon ever made, but even his big old nose couldn't give him many playable cards. The closest one was this Gravitational Drop, which was close to greatness. It would do more damage for each retreat cost on your opponent's active, which we have seen do well in cards like Tangrowth and to a lesser extent Leafeon VMAX as well. But Probopass didn't catch on nearly as much as those two. This one would make your attacks do an extra 30 if you hadn't played supporter card this turn. The problem is, supporter cards in the Pokemon TCG are pretty good, and it's really hard to get set up and stay in the game without playing them. And even with that power boost, these attacks aren't really that great, unless you flip heads on Tumbling Attack, in which case 3 for 110 at the time actually isn't too bad. Nowhere near good enough to actually see competitive play though, and that places it in C tier. So now into Generation 5, and first we're looking at Watchog. Watchog is definitely one of the most forgettable Route 1 rodents, but in the Pokemon TCG, to be fair, it might be one of the worst Pokemon of all time. 7 cards in total since its release, and all of them are trash. Watchog cards tend to fall into 2 camps. Double Colorless Energy to deal middling damage, sometimes on coin flips, or extra damage next turn, or have some kind of controlling effect by discarding cards from your opponent's hand at random, or manipulating cards for the top of their deck, like this Guardian Rising one or this Watchek one. Problem is, these effects are often in format with trainers, like Mars or Chip Ice Axe, which are trying to do the same thing that these Watchog cards are doing, but on trainers, meaning you can actually have a different, often more useful attack for the turn. And that just makes life hard to be a Watchog player. There isn't really much else to say about these cards because they're all just, well, really meh. Like, they're just bad. There's nothing really to say. Bad enough to be in A tier. The only reason Watchog isn't an S tier Pokemon is because hand manipulation can be devastating, especially in the format with N and other hand limiting supporters. So I'm going to put it in A tier instead. Unfezant. Unfezant actually wouldn't look too bad in comparison to the others if Unfezant was a stage 1, but it's actually a stage 2, and that is where it all falls apart. This Roaring Skies one had a fun little use case where you would use its Feather Dance attack to boost its damage by 80 next turn, and then you would risk it all with a Sky attack to hopefully deal 200 damage on a coin flip. Very risky, but bear in mind it can bypass normal evolution rules thanks to its ancient trait. This saw no play though, of course, because it was way too risky. This one can shuffle away both active Pokemon with a triple acceleration energy attachment. Again, this could be fun to use in controlling archetypes, but there are probably better options. This has led Unfezant to have some very underwhelming cards, and it always just falls into bulk boxes all over the world. Enough bulk boxes to be an A tier bad Pokemon. Crustle. Crustle is another Gen 5 Pokemon who doesn't get a lot of love in the Pokemon TCG, having exactly 0 meta relevant cards. There have been some that have some okay effects, like this one that has the Shell Armor ability that reduces damage by 30. This sturdy one will stop it getting one shot if it had full HP. This was ripe for abuse with Max Potion at the time. And the most recent one would reduce damage done by evolution Pokemon by 100 next turn. Kind of fun. But kind of fun doesn't get you into tournament success, unfortunately, so B tier it is for Crustle. So now we're into Gen 6 and we have some stinkers right here. Let's start off with Chestnut. Chestnut is probably the worst first partner Pokemon in the TCG, and maybe the worst Pokemon of all time. 6 cards printed, all of which are rubbish. The closest one to seeing any kind of play is Chestnut V. Its Needle Line ability will bounce back 3 damage counters whenever your active Chestnut V took damage, and this would stack too. So if you had 4 of these in play, you would deal 120 damage back whenever your active Chestnut took damage. This actually was a kind of fun counter to Gardevoir EX decks, since their attackers always had very little HP left, like Drifloon, Screamtail or Zacian, but its attack touchdown just wouldn't apply enough pressure for this to be used in any serious way. Chestnut Break might be one of the worst cards of all time. It is an effective stage 3 Pokemon, since it's a break, that would attack for 4 energy, which would then only deal 160 damage, not enough to one-shot, and after attaching 4 energy you kind of need to be one-shotting stuff. But then to add insult to injury, you would deal 50 damage back to yourself for some ungodly reason, which just made no sense to me. This wasn't even fun to talk about, this is just sad. And bear in mind, both Chestnut you could use to get this Chestnut into play were both pretty bad as well. This makes Chestnut a very, very sad case indeed. Sad enough for S tier. Diggersby. Diggersby has a problem that has always been outclassed from the Bunnelby from Primal Clash, which should either discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck, or shuffle in 2 cards from your discard pile back into your deck, or one of each, because it can attack twice thanks to its ancient trait. That on its own completely invalidates the best Diggersby card from XY base set, which would pretty much let you get back 2 item cards from your discard pile and put them back into your hand. Hey, do you remember Floatzel and Sableye from earlier? This one from Primal Clash let you flip a coin until you get tails, and for each head you would discard the top card of your opponent's deck. Some niche, maybe meme high potential, but again, when you compare this to the Bunnelby from the same set, it falls a bit flat, considering it has a guaranteed 2 cards to mill via its burrow attacks, and you would have to flip at least 3 heads with this Diggersby to beat it. Just not worth it. And even though there have been 9 Diggersby cards in total, they've all been awful, all dealing pitiful amounts of damage for 3 or 4 energy, giving Watchdog a run for its money as the worst first grass rodent Pokemon, making it a C tier bad Pokemon. Go-Goat. From all the 7 non-promo Go-Goat cards, there have only been 2 rare ones, and this doesn't put Go-Goat in good stead for this video. To be fair, the rare one is the best one. Its Sap Sipper ability would force it to deal an extra 80 damage into grass type Pokemon, so Hornleaf would deal 160 for 3 energy into grass type. This was at a time where grass types were actually kind of good with Decidueye GX running about. But for 3 energy, it was still, even with that boost, inefficient. And if you were sitting into anything else, well, just wasting your time. The other rare one would let you grab 2 supporter cards from your deck and do 90 damage for 3 energy, both of which was pretty bad at the time. And we're not even going to bother looking at the uncommons and common ones because it just gets a bit dire. Now, there was a promo one that works much like Celebi EX from TCG Pocket that would start off dealing an initial 60 damage, and then you flip a coin for each grass energy attached to it, and then you would deal an extra 30. So I guess if you're feeling particularly risky, you could try this, but in my opinion the starting damage was way too low for this to be a viable strategy, leaving poor Go-Go to have some nice artwork but some rubbish cards. A tier bad Pokemon it is. But now we're into Gen 7, one of my favourite regions in Alola. We're starting off with Toucannon. And oh boy, we're getting into some real bad Pokemon here. Toucannon has had 3 cards, all of which have a DCE attack that does 60 or 40 damage and a 3 energy attack that deals about 160. When you consider that 2 of these were legal in the tag team era, this just isn't good enough. Even the very first one in the Sun and Moon base set wasn't competitive. I mean, why would you do 100 damage for 3 energy on a stage 2, when you can get 3 for 180 on the basic Drampa EX, which came out in the very next set. At least this one from Lost Thunder has a 1 energy attack, I guess. There really isn't much to elaborate here on Toucannon, I'm afraid. It's just a stage 2 with very underwhelming attacks. Underwhelming enough to be an S tier bad Pokemon. Mudsdale. Guardians Rising is in contention as one of the best sets of all time, which makes this Mudsdale being a pre-release promo very strange. This one, dealing 180 damage for a massive 4 energy, is somehow one of the best ones. Enhanced Stomp, dealing 120 for 3 energy, when Strong Energy got reprinted, and Dancy Prism was actually, well, I guess okay. Bear in mind, Baby Buzzwole would do 120 for 1 energy mine though, on a basic. But that's about as good as it gets for Mudsdale, oh dear. The most recent one can attach a fighting energy to all of your bench Pokemon, which is actually a nice bit of fighting acceleration. Shame its other attack high horsepower, topping out at 140 damage, is a bit tragic. This one, for 3 fighting energy, has a 25% chance of dealing 0 damage, and that right there is terrifying. And this one deals less damage for each retreat cost on your opponent's active, and I'll tell you what, that is never a good sign either. This leaves metagame record of 0 and 0 use cases as well. B tier for Mudsdale. But now we're into Kalos, and we're starting off with Arctozolt. Let's get some low hanging fruit. Arctozolt has had 1 card, and it's this one. A stage 1 fossil that puts 2 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon whenever they attach an energy card from their hand to it. So with Frostmoth and Welder format, this, to be fair, could pick up a little bit of damage. But it just wasn't worth it, so B tier it is for Arctozolt. But it does have some potential of getting better. Arctofish. In a similar vein, Arctofish has had 2 different cards. The first one had a fun effect, where it would reduce damage done to it by 60 next turn. Which in some formats that wasn't Sword and Shield, this might have been enough to push a 1-shot into a 2-shot. But in Sword and Shield format, 210 total damage really wasn't hard to hit at all. Luckily, for all the 4 Arctofish fans all over the world, there is an Arctofish V card as well. And this one had Giga Impact for 220, which is okay. It would KO basic V Pokemon like Zacian, but to be fair, there were always just better options. And Ancient Freeze had a fun use case where it would stop your opponent's defending V or GX Pokemon from attacking next turn, but that was easily mitigated by playing switching cards. So again, I mean, it had a use case, it could deal decent damage, but it wasn't really the best. But it's a lot better than some of the other Pokemon on this list, so C tier it is. Dreadnought. When I first had the idea for this video, Dreadnought sprung to mind as an immediate step in for this spot. But actually looking at the Dreadnought cards in comparison to some of the others we've been looking at here today, it's actually not too bad. First up, Dreadnought VMAX actually saw a little bit of play with ADP, since after the Ultra Creation boost, it could hit 270 damage on a coin flip, which would actually eject a lot of tag team Pokemon in one hit. It also had the Solid Shell ability, which would reduce damage done to it by 30, which gave it an effective 350 HP, meaning it was outside of reach of pretty much everything in the game that wasn't a lightning type. So, you know, not the greatest of ADP partners, but you could use it. This one from Stellar Crown has an ability that would prevent all damage done to it that was over 200, which, to be fair, could catch some decks off guard for a turn or two, but the idea of completely walling for a whole game is probably pretty low, as most decks always have alternative options to attack, like let's say Regidrago V-Star could just attack with the Regidrago V, for example, or even copy the Regidrago V's attack. Vice Wave would auto-paralyze your opponent. If you played Nisa this turn, auto-paralyze is one of the strongest special conditions in Pokemon because it completely locks your opponent from doing anything. But tying it to a supporter that doesn't draw cards makes it hard to loop turn after turn after turn. So while Dreadnought has had some very bad cards, it might be one of the strongest in this video, to be fair, so I have to put it in D tier. Grapploct. Now Grapploct might have the highest percentage of fun unique cards from any Pokemon of all time. For example, this one can attack for 1 fighting energy if it has any damage counters on it. Pretty cool. This one increases the retreat cost of your opponent's active by 2 colorless while it's in the active. This one increases attack cost and retreat cost via its attack Octo Lock. Problem is, these are fun, but there's still no reason to ever use them. Like this one, auto KOs your opponent's active next turn. Okay, that's decent, I guess. But you might as well use Hisuian Zoroark. It does the same thing, but for 0 energy. The Octolock one that boosts retreat cost is all well and good, but you need to evolve and attach to your energy to do the same thing effectively as a Pokemon Go Snorlax, meaning it's really hard to ever use this over a Snorlax, for example. Grapploct V had the Tie-Up attack, which will stop the defending basic Pokemon from attacking next turn. Not bad, until they can just switch around it, of course. And the Moonsault Press attack would deal an above average 240 for 3 energy if you flipped heads. Otherwise you hit 420, which is just cry-inducing. So that means, unfortunately for Grapploct fans, it's just, well, B tier it is. Pincurchin. So it looks like there's a lot of bad Gen 9 Pokemon, and Pincurchin is no exception to that rule. It's awful. Pincurchin V has an ability. Whenever it takes damage from attacks while it's in the active, you can flip 3 coins, and for each heads, you can deal 30 damage back. So offering some kind of residual damage is never a bad thing, but let's be honest, on a 2 prizer with 170 HP, with no lasting power, that is not going to end well for you. What's the attack like then? Well, a flat 3 for 120. This, for reference, would have been outclassed all the way back in 2005, with attackers like Steelix EX who would deal 100 damage to any one of your opponent's Pokemon for 4 energy. So with Pincurchin V being rubbish, are there any other redeeming cards? Well, I'm sure you know the answer to that question. Shocking Needles flips 4 coins and you do 30 for each heads, and if 2 are heads you actually paralyze your opponent's active as well. So fun, but it makes no sense to ever realistically use. Genuinely so sad when I think the best Pincurchin card is this one that does 10 damage to everything in play. So with a telescopic sight you would actually deal 40 damage to all your opponent's benched GX and V Pokemon. There was even a Krabby who would do that, and Noivern and V would do that but deal 20 everywhere instead of 10. So even in this use case, there's no reason to use it. S tier, it just has to be. Overquill. Most of the Hisuian Pokemon got pretty good cards in the Pokemon TCG, like Sneasler, who would boost poison damage, and Arcanine, who would deal 160 damage for 0 energy, or even Basculegion, who would shuffle in all basic energy from your discard pile back into your deck, and deal 20 for each one you shuffled in that way. These are all good cards. One Hisuian Pokemon that never got that treatment though was Overquill. It has 2 cards. The first one would deal a table shattering 120 damage if you had at least 3 dark energy in play. I mean, you know, it's okay I guess. And Pierce isn't really worth talking about. Overquill will poison your opponents and deal 5 damage counters on them in between turns, which again isn't bad, but let's be honest, you're not going to win any games using these, so B tier it is. Gen 9, Mabostiff. Mabostiff might have had a main role in the video games with Arven and all that, but in the TCG, it hasn't had the best of times. This one has half an escape rope on the ability, which we saw on Swellow, and it wasn't any good then, and it's not any good now. This Comeuppance once has an interesting attack, which should mirror all damage back to the defending Pokemon next turn that the Mabostiff took. This might have some fun meme potential, but can never really be used as a build around, too easily played around. And the last one, Mabostiff EX, has Proud Fangs, which is actually okay, dealing 220 damage if your opponent's active has any damage counters on. But when you compare it to, let's say, Miraidon EX's Photon Blaster, which does the same amount of damage, without any precursor damage needed, and having a really good ability, it just makes no sense to why you'd ever use a Mabostiff EX. There's so much better options. And Daunt is kind of fun, reducing damage done by your opponent's active, again until you realise they can just switch around that. That means none of these Mabostiff cards have any realistic use case, but to be fair, they're not truly offensive, so C tier it is. Iron Moth. With all the Paradox Pokemon being basics, it should be hard for them to be bad, because at least you can easily get them into play, unlike Toucannon, especially with all the extra support they have. But that doesn't stop Iron Moth from being awful. This Thermal Reactor one can move fire energy when it comes into the active, which sounds pretty good on paper, right? Especially with Magma Basin being in format. But when you look at that silly attack, it doesn't make sense to why you'd ever want to move those energy onto it, because Heat Ray does a table shattering 120 damage, doesn't even KO fire weak Pokemon. I guess with energy capsules and Iron Crown boost you might be able to get there, but honestly, what's the point? And this next one might seem a bit mean, but for 3 energy, it can make itself immune to Ancient Pokemon next turn. And considering Raging Bolt is a top tier deck in format right now, and so is Ancient Box, which both attack with Ancient Pokemon, this should be good, right? Well, Raging Bolt will always have an answer to this attack until Mask Ogerpon, whose Myriad Leaf Shower will one-shot Iron Moth clean out the way. Meaning this one is actually kind of useless as well. But to be fair, there is hope for Iron Moth to have some good cards moving forward, so maybe the future is looking bright. But for now, I have to give it an A tier. But here is that tier list in all its glory. Let me know in the comments if you agree or what Pokemon I might have missed out. Maybe, if there's enough, we can revisit this and make a part 2. But if you made it this far and you like the video, why don't you like the video and consider subscribing, please? It really helps me out. And why don't you check out this video here, where I look at every Pokemon's best ever card.